Good evening and welcome to All Souls. My name is Galen Gingrich. I'm Senior Minister of this congregation. If you're new to All Souls, I offer you a special welcome. I hope you will find yourself at home here. This is a sanctuary for seekers. The spirituality practiced here depends upon reason rather than revelation as our most certain source of human knowledge. It takes careful account of our dependence upon the people and world around us for every element of our existence. And it takes equal account of our responsibility for other people and the natural world in return. These commitments animate our efforts to unite with other like-minded people to make the world a better place, safer, fairer, more beautiful, and more just. No one has been more tireless in these efforts than Secretary Perry, who honors us with his presence here this evening. Welcome. I'd now like to introduce Guy Quinlan, who chairs the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy and heads up our Nuclear Disarmament Task Force here at All Souls. Guy.
Thank you, Galen. I would like to say a particular word of thanks to Galen Gingrich, our Senior Minister, and to the whole staff of All Souls for making this venue available to us tonight. And to thank you all for coming to hear Secretary Perry speak on this ultimately important issue. And with that, I'd like to introduce Sally Jones of Peace Action New York, who will present the next part of our program.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sally Jones. As you heard, I'm chair of Peace Action Fund of New York State, and I also want to welcome you to this important talk tonight by former Secretary of Defense William Perry. Peace Action New York State has its roots in the civil society side of the No Nukes movement. We began with the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy in 1957 and merged with the nuclear freeze groups in the 80s, eventually getting renamed Peace Action in the 1990s. Today, Peace Action New York State is putting great emphasis on building the next generation of nuclear abolitionists. In the last 5 years, we have organized 14 student chapters all around the New York State area and inspiring other Peace Action affiliates to do the same. Pick up a brochure in the back if you'd like to learn more about us. The book by William Perry, My Journey to the Nuclear Brink, reminds me of one of my first national organizer meetings with Peace Action in Washington, D.C. in around 2009, where I was part of a small group of organizers who heard Max Kampelman, a former Reagan diplomat who was with Reagan and Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland, in October 11th and 12th, 1986, 30 years ago. He told us how close those leaders had come to eliminating the United States and Soviet nuclear arsenals at that meeting. Tonight, 30 years later, I am looking forward to hearing from Secretary Perry how we in civil society can contribute to the closing of that deal in at least some of our lifetimes. And now I would like to introduce Peter Weiss, the President Emeritus of the Lawyers Committee for Nuclear Policy.
In August 1945, William Perry and I were both soldiers in the U.S. Army. He arrived in Hiroshima 2 weeks after the bomb was dropped and had an experience that shook him to the core for the rest of his life. While I was comfortably ensconced at Fort Strong, Massachusetts, a receiving post for German rocket scientists, grateful that I would not be sent to invade Japan to end the war. Dr. Perry has spent part of his distinguished career, both in and out of government, trying to make sure that there never would be another Hiroshima or Nagasaki, culminating in his recently published memoir. I have spent much of the second half of my life pursuing the same objective. The vocabulary of anti-nuclear weapons work is full of double-edged words. Thus, deterrence is a way of saying we are willing to risk mutual assured destruction. Non-proliferation means we keep ours and you don't get yours. Nuclear security ignores the obvious fact that the only true security is a nuclear weapons-free world. But one word is missing. It has disappeared from politics since President Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. I don't mean empire, but I do mean evil. The word most appropriate to describe nuclear weapons and a policy based thereon. So let us now listen to listen to the man arguably best qualified to enter this dialogue with moral passion, unparalleled scientific know-how, and political experience. Dr. William Perry.
Thank you. Thank you. In the nightmare of the dark, all of the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. That poem, written on the eve of World War II, could today be a metaphor for the Middle East, where each nation seems to be sequestered in its hate. But not just the Mideast, where at least nuclear weapons are not in play. The dogs are also barking in Europe, where the hostility could conceivably escalate into a nuclear catastrophe. Today, the United States and Russia have relations which can only be called hostile, comparable in many ways to the bad old days of the Cold War. Russia has dropped its long-term policy of the no first use of nuclear weapons. It's rebuilding its Cold War nuclear weapons, it's flaunting them, and it's threatening its neighbors with them. And it's indirectly threatening the United States. The head of Russian media, Dmitry Kiselov, recently wrote, "Russia is the only nation capable of turning the United States into radioactive ash, which of course is a true statement. The question is, why would he think it was an appropriate statement to make? Rising to this challenge, the United States has begun rebuilding its Cold War nuclear arsenal. We seem to be determined to replay the Cold War nuclear arms race, with costs estimated at about $1 trillion. I mention that number, it means nothing to people. What does $1 trillion mean? It's a lot of money. But well beyond the costs are the terrible dangers associated. Have we simply forgotten the terrible dangers of the Cold War? Several times during the Cold War, we faced the danger of a nuclear war by miscalculation, most dramatically during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Have we forgotten the Cuban Missile Crisis? I will never forget it. I was there during that crisis, working with a small team that prepared the intelligence data each day to sit on President Kennedy's desk the next morning. So I knew exactly what was going on. Indeed, every morning when I went into the analysis center, I truly believed would be my last day on Earth. After the crisis, President Kennedy said that he thought there was a 1 in 3 chance that the Cuban Missile Crisis would escalate into a general nuclear war. Kennedy was an optimist. He did not know, which we now know, that the Soviet Union had tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba, in addition to the medium-range missiles which we were monitoring. And those tactical nuclear weapons already had the nuclear warheads mated with them, and the crews already had the authority to launch them. If Kennedy had accepted the recommendations of his Joint Chiefs of Staff to invade Cuba, our forces would have been decimated on their arrival with tactical nuclear weapons, which undoubtedly would have then escalated into a general nuclear war. To this day, I believe that we avoided a nuclear holocaust as much by good luck as by good management. Today, because of the ongoing hostility between the United States and Russia, we are recreating the conditions that could lead to a nuclear war by miscalculation. Russian troops have already engaged in military operations in Georgia, Crimea, and eastern Ukraine. Russia's justification for these operations included their stated right to protect Russians in these regions. The same rationale could be applied to the Baltics, where there's a large population of Russians, many of them whose loyalties are to Russia, not to their native country. This population would be easy to stir up, to provide a pretext for Russia to send troops in to assist them. Of course, Baltic countries are members of NATO, so an incursion by Russian troops would lead to a military clash between Russian troops and NATO troops. This could be a minor skirmish and perhaps easily resolved, but it could also escalate. And if Russia were losing the conflict, they might do exactly what they have said they would do, namely escalate to tactical nuclear weapons. It is supreme folly for Russia or for the United States to believe that there's any way to use tactical nuclear weapons without it escalating to a general nuclear war. I do not want to be an alarmist. I do not believe that either the United States or Russia want a nuclear war or are planning one. And I think there's a very low probability that one would start in the way that I have just outlined. But that risk, even though low, is one that we should simply not have to take. A higher risk is that of an accidental nuclear war. Because of our policy on launch on warning, an accidental war could result if our missile attack warning system experienced a false alarm. So how likely is that? During the Cold War, there were 3 such false alarms in the United States and 2 that we know about in the Soviet Union. That figures out to be about 1 every 9 or 10 years. One of the false alarms in the Soviet Union has been documented recently in a movie called The Man Who Saved the World. I urge all of you to see this chilling documentary. I personally experienced one of these false alarms, and it changed my life forever. It occurred in October of 1978, at which time I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. I was awoken from a sound sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning, and as I sleepily put the phone to my ear, the voice on the other end introduced himself as the watch officer at the North American Air Defense Command. The general got right to the point. He told me that his computers were showing 200 missiles on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. And for one heart-stopping moment, I thought that we were about to experience the Holocaust that we had narrowly avoided during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the general quickly explained that he had already concluded that it was a false alarm, and that he was calling me to help him determine what had gone wrong with his computers, so that he would have an explanation for the President's morning brief. Well, the sequel to that story is that I could not, over the telephone, identify the problem. It took us 3 days. What finally we learned was that when the operator shift occurred that night, that the computer operator, the new computer operator, mistakenly put into the computer not the operating tape, but a training tape, which looked very much like a real operation. It was human error. That is, our system, with all of its safety features, and they had many, was still vulnerable to a single person erring and bringing about an end to our civilization. Two things saved us from that fate. First, the watch officer that night was exceptionally thoughtful and responsible, for which we can all be thankful. The second, the context for an attack was benign. That is, there were no international incidents underway that made a Soviet attack plausible. But what if? What if the false alarm had occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Or what if it had occurred during one of the Mideast crises a few years before that? In that context, the watch officer surely would have passed the alarm on to the President, who, after being awoken at 3 o'clock in the morning, would have had less than 10 minutes to decide whether to launch our ICBMs before they were destroyed in their silos. And if he ordered the launch, mistakenly, there was no way of recalling the missiles or destroying them in flight. Humans will err again. Machines will malfunction again. So false alarms will happen again. And Russia and the United States both still have their policy, their Cold War policy of launch on warning. Today, relations between the United States and Russia are, as I said, hostile. Any military clash between Russia and NATO, no matter how small, could provide the context for either the Russia or the United States that made an attack seem plausible. So today, just as in the Cold War, we face the possibility of an accidental war destroying our civilization. Besides the return of these two Cold War dangers, we have two dangers that did not exist during the Cold War. a nuclear terror attack, or a regional nuclear war. A regional nuclear war is not a fantasy, it's not a remote possibility. Just this month, Pakistan threatened to destroy India in response to a border skirmish. And this is not just rhetoric. Pakistan has more than 100 nuclear weapons, which are more than enough to destroy India, while of course India is destroying Pakistan, all the while forming soot and smoke into the atmosphere, which will cause a nuclear winter, which will impair all of civilization. So while a regional nuclear war would be devastating to Pakistan and India, it could also have serious consequences around the world. The final nuclear danger is an act of nuclear terrorism. This is perhaps the most likely nuclear catastrophe. We know that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have made attempts to get nuclear weapons, and I believe that if they were able to get them, that they would use them. The barrier to their achieving that objective is the difficulty of making fissile material, the fuel for a nuclear bomb. But if they could somehow obtain just 30 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, they could make an improvised bomb that could be delivered in a truck or a freighter and detonated with the power of the Hiroshima bomb. I'm not going to discuss this possibility further with you, but I would refer all of you to my website, williamjperryproject.org, where if you press the right button, you'll get a 5-minute video imagining the scenario of a nuclear terrorist bomb going off in Washington, D.C. with terrible consequences. Today, there are more than 15,000 nuclear weapons. The scenario that I described to you dramatized the devastation that could be caused by one of them. And the devastation is more than 100,000 deaths, as terrible as that is. But the political and the economic and the social collapse that would result from that. In sum, we have recreated the nuclear dangers of the Cold War, an accidental nuclear war, or a nuclear war by miscalculation. And since the Cold War ended, 2 new nuclear dangers have arisen: nuclear terrorism and a regional nuclear war. Thus, I believe that the likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe today is greater than it was during the Cold War. The likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe today is greater than it was during the Cold War. In spite of this grim assessment, I would like to end on my talk on a positive note. I'm based at Stanford University and spend much of my time with students and with young people. I'm inspired every day by their intelligence, their optimism, and their willingness to work for a better and a safer world. They have been in the vanguard of the actions to protect the world from a disaster caused by drastic climate change, and they are beginning to assume leadership in the arms control area as well. I have more or less given up on my generation, the ones who created the nuclear bomb. My goal is to help educate the generation just coming of age, the so-called millennials, who have not been warped by Cold War thinking. And to that end, I formed this project, the William J. Perry Project, to carry out that education project. The first output of that project is my recent memoir, My Journey at the Nuclear Brink, which has already been mentioned tonight. I believe that I described today's nuclear danger very well in that book, but I also realize that much more is needed. I recognize that at best the book will be read by some tens of thousands of people, most of whom will be elites and most of whom will be adults. So I've been working with a small group of young people who are helping me craft my message using a younger sensibility so that it's more likely to be heard, understood, and shared by their peers. We have to get this message across not to tens of thousands, but to millions. which means we have to use the internet. That does not mean dumbing down the message, but rather using media in a smart way and sharing it on online venues where millennials go for news and information. In that spirit, our project prepared YouTube descriptions, such as the one I just told you about for the nightmare scenario in Washington, D.C. And we have 3 other YouTube videos in production now. And our project has produced a MOOC, a massively open online course, Living at the Nuclear Brink, Yesterday and Today. That can be accessed not just by the hundreds of students at Stanford, but hundreds of thousands of students worldwide. The course has just gone online and is not limited to students. Anyone here can go home tonight and sign up for it. It's free and it has no required exams. You don't take it for a grade, you take it to learn the facts about nuclear dangers and what we can do collectively to lower those dangers. The Director of Education for our project, David Perry, is here with me tonight. He also has in the planning stage 3 shorter MOOCs, which I expect we'll be bringing online next year. Beside these long-term education projects, there's an urgent need for real diplomacy to heal the dangerous rupture between the United States and Russia. Since official diplomacy has not been effective, we are turning to unofficial, sometimes called Track 2 diplomacy. Some of our students at Stanford have organized a study group with other American college students, teamed with a comparable group of students from Russia. They meet twice a year, once at Stanford and once at Russia, and discuss ways of improving U.S.-Russian relations. 2 weeks ago, I met with them at Stanford along with Governor Brown of California and the governor of the Tyumen province in Russia. And we will follow up next year with a meeting in Russia. It is, I'm afraid, a sad commentary on the state of relations between the United States and Russia, but this may be the only serious effort underway today to improve relations between the United States and Russia. Remarkably, it is being organized and carried out entirely by young people in Russia and young people in the United States. The governors and I were only their guests at the meeting at Stanford. In sum, by working with young people, I hope to influence a new generation dedicated to ending this terrible threat of nuclear extinction facing us today. I know that this is pursuing an ideal that seems unattainable, but I will nevertheless continue my pursuit in spite of often being asked, aren't you being a naive idealist, pursuing such unrealistic goals? My answer is borrowed from Andrei Sakharov, the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. He spent his latter years working for political reform in the Soviet Union. What a hopeless task that must have seemed to him. And when a friend wrote to him that he was being too idealistic, he wrote back, and I quote, "There is a need to create ideals even when you cannot see a path to achieving them, because when there are no ideals, then there is no hope." Sakharov did pursue his ideals, and by doing so, he kept hope alive in the Soviet Union for major political reforms that did indeed come, but sadly are fading away again. Even when my friends accept that it may be worth pursuing one's ideal, they do note my age and ask politely why I don't simply settle down to enjoy my golden years in that Garden of Eden known as Palo Alto, California. But retirement is not on my agenda. I will continue on my quest to avoid a nuclear catastrophe as long as I am able. For I believe that time is not on our side. And I believe that having helped develop our nuclear weapons, I know better than most how to dismantle them. And I believe that I have a special responsibility to do so. Or I could answer them with the lines of Robert Frost. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I know that. Would you like to take a seat and I'll collect a few questions?
What's that?
If you take a seat, I'll collect a few questions.
It's up to you. How you handle it, however you want.
Have a seat.
Yeah.
So my name is John Burrows. I'm the Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. And we do have some time for some questions, some answers, maybe a little bit of discussion. But I would ask that you keep your questions or your comments reasonably brief. So the floor is open. I'll take several questions and then turn the floor back over to Dr. Perry. Okay, Lillian.
How important has disobedience been in preventing accidents, in preventing action following this?
How important has disobedience been in preventing accidents?
Have there not been incidents where it was either a Soviet officer or an American officer who disobeyed it
Apparently, we don't have extra mics, so I'm going to do my best to repeat the questions. And the question is, haven't there been incidents where disobedience by Soviet or American officers prevented catastrophe? Sir.
Along those lines, what is Dr. Perry's estimate of nonviolent civil disobedience against nuclear weapons, such as Sister Megan Rice and her colleagues performed in Tennessee, and she spent 2 years in prison after throwing blood on these nuclear weapons. What is Dr. Perry's candid opinion of such actions, please?
Okay, the question is, what is Dr. Perry's estimate of nonviolent civil disobedience, such as that carried out by Sister Megan Rice and colleagues? I believe that's Susie in the back? Yeah.
Yes, hi. Good evening, everybody. I will try to speak as loudly as possible in my best church voice. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Perry, for coming. Thank you very much, our schools, for having us event tonight. I was inspired by your quote, Sakura, no ideals mean no hope. And this week, countries are voting on whether to start negotiations on a new treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. That vote is set to take place on Thursday. And I believe that is an ideal which all of us can hope for. And I wonder, Dr. Perry, can you help us in support of this treaty?
Okay, the question from Susie Snyder was, this week, countries at the United Nations are voting on a resolution that would launch negotiations next year on a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. And I believe you said, Susie, Dr. Perry, would you support this effort? Did you want to follow on that, Christian, or?
Considering that we are approaching this historic moment and your personal commitment to nuclear disarmament, I'm curious about your views on the Ladder Treaty and the future of nuclear disarmament negotiations in 2017. Thank you.
So Christian asks a slightly different version of the same question to the effect of, what are your views on the ban treaty, the prohibition treaty that's now being pursued at the United Nations? Well, I think that's enough questions. Now, do you want me to repeat them, or?
Yes.
Okay, the first one is, have there been instances where Soviet and American officers have prevented catastrophe by civil disobedience or by disobedience?
I can only think of, only one comes to mind. I referred you to a movie called The Man Who Saved the World. That movie depicted an incident which occurred in 1982 in Russia, very similar to the phone call that I got in 1978 in the United States. Namely, the Russian missile attack system was signaling that an attack was underway from the United States. The officer didn't believe it. Again, there was no context for such an attack. He also had training in computer and understood that computers sometimes err. So, against the urging of his subordinates, he refused to send the warning up to the President of Russia. And it turned out he was right. It was an error. The attack was not underway. And so he saved the world. That's why the movie is called The Man Who Saved the World. That was, however, an act of disobedience on his part. He was not following his orders. And his reward for having saved the world was to get an official reprimand from Soviet authorities for not following orders.
Okay. There was also a question, what is your assessment of nonviolent civil disobedience, such as that practiced by Sister Megan Rice?
I think it's heroic, so I can admire the people that do it, but I also try to want to measure the effectiveness of doing it. So I try to focus my attention to what actions have some significant effect. There was a large movement in this country in the early 80s, 82, which led to huge protests, including meetings right here, large meetings, massive meetings in Central Park. Those had a degree of effectiveness, not only because they were large scale, but because they were reflecting a view held by much of the population. I do not believe civil disobedience on nuclear issues would be effective today because people do not understand what the dangers are. I claim that the first step has to be education. Education before civil disobedience, education before political activism. I still indulge myself occasionally in political activism. I wrote just 2 weeks ago an op-ed for the New York Times arguing that we should not proceed with the rebuilding of our ICBM programs. I did that because it made me feel good, because what I was saying was I thought correct. I have no expectation it's going to be effective for the reasons I've described to you. So I'm putting 90% of my time perhaps into education because I don't think other actions will be effective. They may give me therapeutic, as it was therapeutic for me to write that op-ed, but I don't think they'll be effective.
Then we had 2 questions asking for your assessment and or for your support of the effort now underway in the General Assembly to adopt a resolution that would launch negotiations on a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons next year.
I'll make 2 comments about it and then turn to John here. I support the proposal. I do not believe, for reasons I've described to you, it will have much effect. Having said that, in terms of an assessment of the treaty, I want to turn that over to John, who's been working closely with the UN and who knows much more about it than I do. John, could you answer that question, please?
This, as it is being put forward by the leading sponsors in the General Assembly, this treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons would be adopted in a form in which it would prohibit development, possession, use, deployment, etc. of nuclear weapons. So, sounds great, right? However, the nuclear weapon states, including the United States, have said we are not going to participate in such negotiations. Most of the nuclear ally countries are also showing opposition to it, although they waver in that. So there's the prospect of a treaty that would be negotiated and brought into force by countries around the world that do not now have nuclear weapons, and furthermore are actually obligated not to acquire them by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now here's the funny thing. This treaty is being vociferously opposed by the nuclear weapon states. Why? And I think that my colleague Ray Atchison and others have a very good answer to that question. It's because this effort is attacking the legitimacy of nuclear weapons. And so I think that's a good enough reason to support it in and of itself. I'm not going to say any more on this subject because we could consume the rest of the evening on it.
Let me just make one.
Okay.
I just want to inject one other point. I keep talking about effectiveness of action. I spent most of my life either the executive in industry or running the Defense Department, and I'm used to taking actions which have some effect. I measure my actions by their effect. When I was secretary, for example, I was responsible for dismantling 8,000 nuclear weapons. 8,000. That gave me a lot of personal satisfaction, but the reason I spent the time that it took to make that happen was I could see the act, I could see the result of my actions. Most of you don't have that luxury. Well, you have to, if you want to pursue a cause, you pursue it because you think it's right. You cannot see the immediate results. You cannot see the immediate effect at the end of it. So you should not be discouraged because you cannot see an immediate effect. You can strive for an effect, but sometimes you're doing it just because you think it's the right thing to do.
Is Daniela here? Come on up, Daniela. I need a little bit of help seeing who is raising their hand. So Daniela is interning with the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy this fall and working, she's a student at New York University. So I've gone a little bit up this, let's go up this way here. Let's say I see a young man over here, so I'll call on you.
Hi, my name is Robert. I'm the USA Food Delegation. My question is huge. How do we create a sense of urgency as well as really raising awareness and really orienting people's attention towards a complete nuclear zone.
And was there somebody right sitting near you who had a question? Okay.
What do you feel is like the difference with the deadlock actually getting similar results for nuclear weapons? I just want to know really
So I didn't quite get your question. It was biological and chemical weapons are prohibited. How do we do something similar for nuclear weapons? Is that right?
What has been for those that are successful, what has been the deadlock and getting similar results for nuclear weapons?
Okay, more questions going up this side. I see Elizabeth. So I think that's probably enough questions. The first question was, what do we do to create a sense of urgency? And a second question had to do with the differences in controlling biological and chemical weapons and nuclear weapons. I hope it's something like that. Okay. We'll get to the third question.
What will create a sense of urgency is the first nuclear bomb that goes off in one of our cities. Whether it's a nuclear terrorist bomb or whatever. I would very much like to see us take actions to reduce that likelihood so we don't have to get a wake-up call that way. But I do believe that the urgency that comes with understanding the problem does require this education program I'm describing, so it's going to take a couple of years. And we can only hope that during that couple of year period of education, that the bomb doesn't go off to accelerate that education. Not only because of the disastrous consequences of a bomb going off, because I have no doubt that if a nuclear bomb goes off in one of our cities, that the response to that bomb, the governmental response to that bomb, the people's response to that bomb, we take a set of actions highly detrimental to our democracy. We will react not in a thoughtful and considered way, but in a panicked way. And incidentally, in my short video on a nuclear terror bomb, I also describe that problem. The panicked, ill-considered reaction to a disaster like that. That was, second question was?
The differences between controlling biological and chemical weapons on the one hand and nuclear on the other.
There's a big difference on controlling them. Because of the difficulty, extreme difficulty and complexity of making nuclear fuel, either highly enriched uranium or plutonium. That's not a process which an individual can do, or even a well-financed terror group can do. It's a large, complex industrial process. And so the biggest deterrent we have today to a nuclear terror bomb going off in the cities is the difficulty of producing the nuclear fuel. If the terror group could get 30 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, they could improvise a bomb. It would be crude, but it doesn't have to be sophisticated. It doesn't have to go onto a warhead. It could be delivered in a truck or a freighter. And we can call it crude, we can call it improvised, but when it detonates with the same power as a Hiroshima bomb. So do not mistake improvised and crude meaning not powerful. It only applies to the sophistication of the packaging and the delivery system. So the only thing that's stopping that happening is the difficulty of creating highly enriched uranium. So a terror group either has to buy that or steal that in order to get the highly enriched uranium to do that. I guess the third alternative is some of the countries that have nuclear weapons, Pakistan being one, have groups within the government that support terror groups and oppose to the government. And you might imagine them stealing it from within the government laboratories. So those are the possibilities. And on the other hand, the biological weapons, they're not easy to make, but the ingredients to make them are available. So it takes a very sophisticated, very talented designer, and you could make a biological weapon which could be quite deadly. The biggest technical impediment to making biological bombs is package them so they can be delivered in an effective way. Fortunately, that is somewhat difficult. But the common way of delivering them, which is to make a nebulizer, an aerosol, if you had a technique for making just an aerosol, the kind that's used commercially, you could disperse the body. You could walk down an airport and disperse the biological weapons as you walk down the aisles of the airport. So there's a big difference in the ease of making a biological weapon as opposed to a nuclear bomb. The results are also quite different. A biological bomb would be disastrous. A nuclear bomb would be catastrophic, if I can make the distinction between the two.
Now there was also a question from my friend and colleague Elizabeth Schaefer. First of all, she said she thinks it's important to be educating next generations, and she wishes her adult but young children would be taking this to heart, if I understood you correctly, Elizabeth. But her question was, do you see a linkage between nuclear disarmament and climate protection?
My good friend, Governor Jerry Brown, has made a career out of fighting climate change would have disastrous impact on our environment. And I believe that he's probably done more than any other single person in the world in practical, effective means to avoid this climate change. He's done it by position as governor of California. He's been able to introduce legislation in California which has a profound effect on what happens in California. And it turns out many other states and even some other countries are following the lead of California. For example, he's imposed very rigid restrictions on automobiles, limiting the amount of, limiting their ability to contaminate the environment. And because that applies to automobiles in California, any automobile company that wants to sell automobiles in California designs the cars that way. So cars all over the country, all over the world are built with these same features. This has had a profound effect. But he's also said he is of the age, he's still younger than I am, but he's of the age where he only wants to spend his time working with existential issues, issues which really affect his existence, the existence of younger people all around the globe. And so he's focused on two things: climate change and nuclear catastrophe. He read my book. He read it actually twice. He showed me his copy. It was earmarked and annotated all the way through it. He really read it. And then he wrote a book review for it for the New York Review of Books. He believes these are the two great issues facing the world today: disaster by climate change or disaster by nuclear means. And he devoted his life to working to try to deal and control those two. So they have that in common. They're both existential dangers. The big difference between the two is the nuclear catastrophe could happen soon, whereas the climate change, we will not see the results of it for several decades, perhaps. So we have longer time to work, perhaps, on climate change. Whereas the nuclear disaster, the nuclear catastrophe is a sort of Damocles hanging over our head every day.
Yes, let's go to the back. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
John, this will have to be your last question. You're going to have to do the last question.
This, you want to just answer this? And
Let's just answer that last one, and then I have to go.
okay. You know it's just 8 o'clock.
Yeah, leave it 8.
Well, 8:30, that's it. 4.
Okay, it's cool.
But also, do you feel the energy? That's her question.
We'll go through more. I don't have the energy to go half an hour now.
Okay, we'll do just a couple more questions. Let's, this gentleman here. Who are you? Is he on the left?
I'm Edward Friedman. I teach nuclear policy courses at Stevens Institute of Technology across the river. I was very taken by Secretary Kerry's comments about establishing linkages between young people in the United States and Russia to get at issues where the establishment is not making very much progress. You mentioned the danger of nuclear terrorism coming out of Pakistan, and Pakistan seems to be intractable in terms of lessening their activities in the nuclear area. Do you see any opportunity for civil society dialogue among students or others between individuals in the United States and Pakistan?
Can you give him some more water? Does he see any opportunity to do what?
I was wondering if there's an opportunity, if the Secretary sees any opportunity to initiate civil society dialogue between individuals in the United States and Pakistan that might parallel what he's doing in Russia, because such initiative, in my view, is very much needed since the dangers in Pakistan are quite considerable.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Now, let's see. Is there, in the back, the young man on the left? Yes. That's. Can you just come forward? Because I'm not making this out at home. So. Yeah, keep coming. Can somebody repeat that to me? Okay. Okay, so here's the first of your last three questions. China is reported to be upgrading its arsenal. How should the United States deal with other countries updating, improving their arsenals?
There's not much we can say to a country about upgrading its arsenal when we're upgrading our own arsenal. So we have to, I guess the answer is we should lead by example, and our example is not one we would like others to follow.
And the next question is that this gentleman sitting right here feels there is an urgent need for communication dialogue between the United States and Pakistan. Do you see any opportunity for U.S.-Pakistani civil society dialogue of the kind you have worked upon in other settings?
Yes, I do. In fact, George Schultz and I at Stanford undertook about 5 years ago a U.S.-Pakistan, a U.S.-India, and a U.S.-Pakistan-India dialogue in civil society. It was so-called Track 2 diplomacy, more like Track 1.5, because all of the participants were former government officials, former secretaries of state, a minister of foreign affairs, a minister of defense. That, to me, was a very revealing and I would say disturbing dialogue. While I was concerned with the possibility of an India-Pakistan war before the dialogue, I became more concerned about it after I heard the dialogue. I heard the Pakistanis themselves expressing their fear that a conflict between India and Pakistan was likely, and that if it happened, that India would surely go to use, or that Pakistan would surely go to using tactical nuclear weapons. So while we had that dialogue, and while we had relatively good communication between the Indians and Pakistanis at that, and they went back to their own countries and tried to get the message across to their own government, I think the primary thing that came to me from that Track 2 dialogue was the danger of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. The danger of a regional nuclear war was even greater than I'd realized before the dialogue, and nothing I heard in that dialogue showed me a clear path to solution. As those of you who have followed India and Pakistan at all know, the underlying cause for the hostility between those two countries is the dispute over Kashmir. To which country should Kashmir belong? It's deeply felt conviction on the part of both countries. Both countries have built the nuclear arsenals, well over 100 in each country, and still building. Pakistan has built what they call tactical nuclear weapons and have proclaimed they would use them if an Indian army, with a conventional army, was involved in Pakistan. So I would say it's probably the most dangerous situation in the world. That and the possibility of a nuclear terror bomb originated in Pakistan leads me to put Pakistan as the #1 danger spot in the world for some kind of a nuclear catastrophe. I'm sorry to say. What we did find out, or what we did conclude in that, is while nothing we could do in an unofficial capacity would have much to do to change either India or Pakistan's view of who owned Kashmir, was we observed that there was almost no trade, economic ties between India and Pakistan. Surprising, I mean, our closest neighbor, Canada, is our biggest trading partner. Why isn't that true between India and Pakistan? It has to do with the underlying hostility, but it's also true that trade can serve as a bridge and a way of reducing those hostilities. So we ended up urging and recommending both to the civilians in that meeting and to government officials they do everything they could to increase trade between India and Pakistan, not only for the economic benefit it brings, but for the possible security, national security benefit it brings. In other words, the deterrent to actually going to war with each other. The example we have of that is China and Taiwan, which for decades was a tinderbox waiting to explode. And when I've been working on track 2 with China and Taiwan years ago, I recommended to both countries they do things to increase their trade, in particular take the formative step of restarting air traffic, commercial air traffic between Taiwan and China. They did that almost 7 or 8 years ago now. Trade has gone up substantially since then, and nowadays, of all the problems we see about in the Western Pacific, the one we're not talking about is a war between Taiwan and China. And I do believe that the greatly increased trade makes the difference. It's a huge deterrent. We have, for decades, during the Cold War, we had something called mutual assured destruction, which is no country was going to launch a nuclear weapon on the other side because it knew it would be destroyed. So that awful term, MAD, mutual assured destruction, served as a deterrent during the Cold War. What happens now between India and China, I would call mutual assured economic destruction. They're so economically dependent on each other that a war would be disastrous for that reason alone.
And there was one more question which relates to the policies of the next administration. What will they be? What should they be? Is that?
The answer to the first question is I don't know. On the grounds of the second question, I will be promoting as well as I can 2 major policy thrusts. The first policy thrust is find a way of healing the rupture between the United States and Russia, which is not going to be easy. And the second is finding a way to first stop, put a halt to the restarting of the nuclear arms race, and then see if we can find after that, find a way of starting to back down again. These two go together. As long as there's a hostility between US and Russia, we'll never succeed on the second one. So we need to get both of those things, and I think those are the 2 paramount policy issues for the next American president. Thank you.
Did you want to say anything now? So we really owe Dr. Perry gratitude for his wise and, relatively brief comments tonight. And so I'm going to ask you to applaud for him again.
Thank you, John. And thank all of you.